back, and so we're covering this is the first, I believe, of 3 Miles Davis records that we are going to be covering. This album was recorded between November 15th, 1959 and March 10th, 1960, and it was released on July 18th, 1960. So Miles Dewey Davis III, kind of like the Dewey part of that, was born on May 26, 1926 in Alton, Illinois, which is just north of St. Louis, Missouri. And he grew up in a pretty affluent family, as his father worked as a dentist while his mother was a music teacher and violinist. And the family actually also owned a 200-acre farm in Arkansas where they operated a profitable pig farm. So I don't know how the Venn diagram works out where dentistry, musicianship, and pig farming goes, but they were able to hit all 3 of them. And despite the fact that they lived approximately 6 hours away from this pig farm. So I don't have any more information on it. I just know that that's part of the reason that they had a lot of money.
They ran a pig farm that was 6 hours, or did you say 6 miles?
6 hours. I
6
Google
hours away.
I Google mapped it. And it said in today's driving conditions, it would take you 6 hours.
So it's probably longer then.
Possibly. Yeah. So I wish I had.
Well, it had to be, right? It had to be. It was 1960. Yeah.
So. Miles grew up always loving music, especially the blues, big band, and gospel. And in 1935, he received his first trumpet as a gift from a friend of his father's. And Davis then started taking lessons from the man he would call, quote, the biggest influence on my life, Elwood Buchanan, who taught Davis how to play the trumpet, specifically without any vibrato. And he also encouraged him to play with a clear mid-range tone. And by the age of 12, Davis would cite music as the most important thing in his life. So in 1944, a pretty seminal moment happened for Miles Davis. Billy Eckstein, who was a band leader, came to town with his band, which included Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker, who is known in the jazz world simply as Bird. And Davis was invited to play with the band when the trumpet player fell ill, and he actually played with the band for a couple of weeks. And essentially, Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker became his idols. And after he graduated high school, he moves to New York and enrolls in Juilliard, where he stays for about 3 semesters. And he eventually drops out. He claims that he really got a lot out of the, learning music theory and working on his technique. But he also complained that they focused too much on classical European and white repertoire at Juilliard, which was not very surprising at all. So he leaves Juilliard, and then he basically just focuses all of his time playing in various clubs on 52nd Street in the city. And he's something I found very interesting, that how the jazz artists at this time just interchanged and played with so many different bands, like so many different variations of bands. And so he's playing with Dizzy Gillespie, he's playing with Bird, he's playing with Charles Mingus, Eckstein, and just a whole number of other artists.
It's almost as if they were improvising their lineups, Matt.
Ooh. They might have been, John. Yeah, because guys would just show up and they'd just be like, you want to play? Yeah, let's play, right? If somebody got sick or a lot of people were on heroin and doing lots of drugs and probably missed a lot of shows, so they had to pick up where they could. But Davis does travel to Paris eventually, and he feels like he's being treated much better in Paris, and he falls in love with a French actress. Josh, have you ever heard of Juliette Greco?
No, I have not.
She's a French actress that he fell in love with. And they fell in love even though they didn't speak each other's languages. So they had such a deep connection that they would just look at each other and they just knew what they were feeling.
Wow.
Apparently.
I think there's more to the story than that, Matt.
They probably did some boning.
Yeah, I think so.
So he gets back to the States and he's very depressed, remembering, how black people are treated in the U.S. He's depressed. He misses Juliette Greco, and then he starts getting into heroin. And so he's really starts fighting his battle with drug use, heroin, and cocaine for many, many years. Tries to kick the habit, doesn't really work. At some points he would pawn his trumpet, and in order to play in performances, he would have to borrow other people's trumpets. He also resorted to pimping to help to fund his drug habit. So he got very much into the drugs.
In fairness, Matt, it ain't easy.
It's not.
Yeah.
I think he coined that term. So he also developed quite a temper and got into many altercations. He did cite boxer Sugar Ray Robinson as being a major influence, and he also adopted that guy's arrogant attitude. To the point where it did such damage that in 1955 he actually had to have an operation to remove some non-cancerous polyps from his larynx, and the doctors told him not to speak for a couple of weeks because he needed to let the larynx heal. But of course he gets into a heated argument and he does permanent damage to his vocal cords, and for the rest of his life he spoke with a rasp. So that's why he's always Miles talk like this. I think something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he's John, you'll appreciate this. He was under contract with Prestige Records when George Avakian from Columbia Records saw him play at the Newport Jazz Festival, and he offered him a contract to play with Columbia, but Davis was still under contract with Prestige. So he was contractually bound to produce 4 more records for Prestige, and in a move that probably inspired one of your favorite bands, The Clash, to do something very similar.
Roll them all together.
Yep, he records 4 albums worth of material in 2 one-day sessions.
Whoa.
Sandinista +1. Yeah.
So he just bangs out. He's like, let's just do this. So, but actually the albums were all released from 1957 to 1961. So they were released sporadically. But they were the titles were Cooking with the Miles Davis Quintet, Relaxing with the Miles Davis Quintet, Working with the Miles Davis Quintet, and Steaming with the Miles Davis Quintet.
But not Leaving with the Miles Davis Quintet. Yeah, it should have been the last one. Yeah.
Another interesting thing with Davis, because he was a very obviously he was a very talented musician. He and his group in 1957 performed the score for a French film. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, and even though I did take French, I probably should be able to. But they recorded the score. They didn't really write it. It was totally improvised by the band actually watching the movie and improvising, watching this, being inspired by the scenes that they were seeing from the film. And actually, the film generated so much interest more so because of the soundtrack rather than the movie itself. And the album did much better than the actual film did.
Yeah, that's unusual. They don't often see the movie before they score a song.
Yeah, and I think that's what. Yeah, and that was definitely Davis saying, "This is how we're going to do it. I want to see what the movie is, and we're just going to play the emotion that we see."
And can I share one thing real quickly, Matt? Mm-hmm. I just Wikipedia Juliet Greco, and boy, is that going to be a cleaning stacks for you next week, because she is the ultimate in ultimate stereotypes of French actresses. It is remarkable. It's I'll give you a hint. This Wikipedia page is amazing, but I'll shut up for a while.
All right, we can clean that. So in 1955, we have to talk a little bit about Kinda Blue, which is the record that he came out with then, which is named after the feeling that he felt that it gave off. And it remains the greatest selling jazz album of all time, selling over 4 million copies. And in 2009, the U.S. House of Representatives, in a rare showing of bipartisanship, voted 409-0 to pass a resolution that honored it as a national treasure. I don't even know why the U.S. House of Representatives is like, why are they doing this? That just seems, I don't know. I would think that they have better things to do. But they did it because it's that good of an album, I guess. So now I'm almost getting to the album. There's not long after the release of Kind of Blue, Davis gets into an altercation with a police officer outside a club that he was recording at. He was escorting a woman to a cab and proceeded to hang out by the entrance of the club to smoke. Police officer comes up and asks him to move along, and of course Davis refused. And the next thing you know, the cops are involved. Their witnesses describe that a cop came up and started beating him with a nightstick. He was taken to jail and charged for assaulting an officer, even though he didn't really assault anybody. He was just kind of probably defending himself. But he gets stitches and he's released on bail. He's eventually acquitted, but it is a very important incident for Miles Davis in his life. He said, quote, "This changed my whole life and my whole attitude again, and it made me feel bitter and cynical when I was starting to feel good about the things that had changed in this country." So, yeah, Miles Davis was kind of a spitfire, and he certainly had his own issues with racism in America and the way that the police were treating African Americans. So we're getting to, now Sketches of Spain is in 1960. He is inspired to create this record after a couple of different incidents. One was his wife, Francesca Frances Davis, I'm sorry, who was a dancer, and that's another cleaning the stacks, John, that you want to talk about, because they're dynamic. They were like the Beyonce and Jay-Z of the 1950s. They were two very attractive, famous people who were pretty full of themselves. So it was kind of an interesting relationship that, of course, turned to
my
go
favorite
sour.
type of relationships in celebrity world. Yes,
and it goes sour, but that's a story from a different time. But she brings Miles Davis to see a flamenco performance, and he is very inspired by it. And he just proceeds to go try to buy up every flamenco album that he can find in record stores. And he also goes to visit a friend out in L.A. who plays for him this Concerto de Arwanez by the Spanish composer Joaquin Rodrigo. And so Davis was immediately blown away by the melody, and he felt that he had to record it. And he calls up Gil Evans, who is a arranger and composer that Davis had worked on several albums with before. And so they decide that they want to create this, they certainly wanted to record this song, and it just kind of morphed into more of an album that's very influenced by Spanish music. And so that's kind of how they came about this. So I'm going to stop there because that was a hell of a lot of bio, but Miles Davis is quite the complicated character, and some of that stuff is kind of important to know about who he was as a person. But let's talk about our reactions to this record. Let's start with John. What did you think?
I did not like this album. In fact, probably of the jazz albums we've done, it's the one I've liked the least. I will say it is the least, well, I shouldn't say least experimental, but I think it's probably going to be the easiest on the ear for a non-jazz listener. But I found it, I don't know, it didn't move me in the way that I thought it would, which is very interesting to me because I'm familiar with Miles Davis' work from the 60s and later 60s and 70s, which is very interesting. But speaking of scoring things, it seemed like he was scoring Don Quixote is how I felt when I was listening to this. It was, nothing really inspired me. It was subtle, and I could appreciate the musicianship, but unlike some of the other albums we've listened to, like Eric Dolphy and Pharoah Sanders, where my appreciation has grown, and I've actually gone back and listened to it and really gained an appreciation for it, and unlike John Coltrane, where there's the explosions of talent in both the sax and the piano, certainly Miles Davis is not lacking talent, but it just I don't know. I listened to it many times. It just never really struck me. And I was actually surprised it was thought of as highly as it was, because it just seemed to be a very straight ahead piece of music that while good was not up to its reputation, I think. So that's my initial thoughts, but I'd be happy to go into the nuts and bolts of the actual musicianship and stuff once, you and Josh have your say.
Okay. Josh?
This jazz album seemed the most cinematic to me. This almost felt like a film score to me, this album. Every song, it was definitely evocative of Spain. I got that feeling, even though I've never been to Spain. I imagine this is what the type of music that would be like, and there's a lot of use of Spanish instruments, which is different than the other jazz albums that we've listened to. And the trumpet just sounds so, like you said, Matt, where he plays in that medium range, it just sounds so different than the saxophones that we've heard and the clarinet and those other instruments. The way he holds those notes, he holds notes really long, as opposed to a lot of the free jazz that we've listened to with Coltrane and everyone, where they're playing all these notes at once or in these patterns. He likes to hold them, and I think that really contributes to the cinematic feel of this album for me. It's almost like a film noir, some sort of like globetrotting drama, maybe something like Talented Mr. Ripley or something like that. And so while I wasn't blown away by this album, I did enjoy it. Like John, I don't understand why it's ranked so high on here, other than maybe the fact that it's Miles Davis and they wanted to put 60s Miles Davis on this list, or critics, this best ever albums is a combination of many different lists. But
I will
Go ahead.
I will say that famous critic Robert Christgau was one of the few people who was less enthusiastic about it. I remember in reading about this as we were doing it, he described this album as, in 1960, it catapulted Davis into the favor of the kind of man who reads Playboy and initiated in me one phase of a disillusionment with jazz that resulted in my return to rock and roll for the foreseeable future. So we were not alone, maybe, in not being blown away by this album.
So I think a couple of things. This is certainly different than the jazz that we've heard already. And I didn't even think of this till you were talking, Josh. But yeah, all the other jazz records were primarily, the main people behind it were saxophone players. Mm-hmm. And so this is the first time that the trumpet player is kind of, up towards the front. This is actually a term that I came across that described this music is third stream. And third stream is a synthesis of jazz and classical music. Okay. So this is to me, it's much more structured. It's there's a huge orchestra playing behind him, right? So that's another difference.
Yes.
You're not just talking about Miles Davis on trumpet, John Coltrane on sax, Mingus on bass, and Blakey on drums or whatever. You're talking about tens and tens of musicians that are playing a specific notes like an orchestra does. Okay, there's not much improvising.
Well, and you could definitely hear like French horns and oboes. And I'm not even a great musical connoisseur on stuff like that, but they very much stand out because of the space in the album. Yes. Yeah, and like you said, I can't even imagine how many people played on this. I think, didn't he play the flugelhorn at one point? I had to look it up to see what that sound was I was listening to. So
yeah, it's like a scrunched up looking fat trumpet.
That must be why it sounds so cinematic, because it's a full orchestra and he's essentially conducting it.
Yeah, so this album is much about Gil Evans as it is about Miles Davis, right? Because Evans is doing a lot of the arranging. He's actually writing a number of the pieces on this album are actually written by him. And he's taking care of the orchestra, and then you have Davis playing the trumpet, and that is much more of an improvised. When he's coming in and his sound is front and center, that's where the improvisation's coming through. That's where the jazz is coming through. So this is a much more structured, type of record that is very grounded in the music and the notes that the band is playing. Although it's interesting to note, too, that the trumpet section, the original trumpet section that was playing, frustrated Davis because even though they were supposed to be playing what was written down as, the piece of music that they were playing, he still wanted and instructed these players to, if you're feeling something, you don't have to play everything as it's written. You can still go off a little bit. You can play around with it. And he said he really confused the hell out of these musicians who are used to playing like robots, right? I play this note this way specifically, and although Davis appreciated their musicianship, he really didn't respect that type of, that wasn't his thing, right? He's like, you got to feel this. This is music that you feel. So he gets other trumpet players to be able to have a little bit more freedom, a little bit more improvisation, because he said the other people couldn't improvise their way out of a paper bag, was how he put it. So, I knew this record. And I've had this record for many years, and I did listen to it a lot when I first got it. I think my reaction then was very similar to you guys. It was a little uninspired. I wasn't really feeling it too much. I think I always really liked the second track, Will of the Wisp. I love the way that he plays the trumpet on that. He's playing so high, and he's got the mute going on there, and it's just it's a very cool sound, and it's a very cool, and the orchestra behind it, what they're playing, this little, I don't even know how to describe it, this eerie kind of
It's very
almost
spooky.
Yeah.
That's the feeling I got.
Yeah, that's a great song. That
cool is my favorite song on the track. And it's the one that, it's interesting because you talk about how much of a focus was on improvisation. That's really the only one that feels to me, to some degree, improv'd. The rest seems a lot more structured. Yeah. The fifth song, a little bit, when it gets into sort of that flamenco sound, it kind of breaks a little bit, but yeah, I agree. Will o' the Wisp is the best, and even kind of ties into what a Will o' the Wisp is. It sounds like what a Will o' the Wisp theoretically is. So,
what is a Will o' the Wisp?
It's like a light constellation, is the best way I can describe it, sort of. Josh, unless you want to describe it.
Oh, I thought it was like a ghost or something. but maybe
I don't know. I just thought it sounded cool. But if you listen again, because after knowing this record and kind of, not being terribly inspired by it, but in doing the research, learning a little bit more about what he's doing, you can tell where the improvising is coming in. Particularly, and the reason I picked the song Saeta in right before my portion of the podcast here is because Davis called this the hardest piece for him to play, not only in this album but maybe in his entire career. And that song's where they kind of have the marching band music kind of coming in and then fading out, and then Davis plays his solo, and then the band comes in. So that's supposed to be, kind of exemplifying a tradition in a part of Spain where the band would be like playing, a marching band would be playing, and then they would stop at below the balcony of a female singer, and she would then come out and sing a rendition of the Passion of the Christ, right? And so it was supposed to be joyful, and it was also supposed to be very sad. And so Davis, in that trumpet part, he's supposed to be the voice, and he is trying to convey that sadness and that joy at the same time. And he decides, I'm only going to play this once or twice, because if I try to play it more than once or twice, I'm not going to be able to evoke the feeling that I need to feel. So he was really getting that heavy into it, and that's the part of this where you can see that whole part that he's playing there, John, is totally improvised. And a lot of the trumpet parts that he's doing on here are very much improvised, even though it doesn't sound like it. And I think that in part might be because he's not playing fast, he's not going crazy. It's very deliberate. It's very smooth. And he also says that with this album, the less he played, or at least the lower he played in terms of volume, the better it was. If he was belting out too much or going too crazy, it was going to make the sound and the overall album worse.
And therein lies the genius, I think, of him, and also the classical training. As much as he might have not wanted to be unmoored from it, right? He also benefited from it because he could improvise in a way that also sounded classically structured. I think for me, it's just a simple preference. I like a little bit more of the chaos, if we're going to go that way. And in improv, I like a little bit more. I like it a little sloppier than this is. I don't like my jazz neat. And I think that's where maybe I've differed from you guys a little bit. I like my jazz to be, if I'm going to listen to it, I like it to be interesting and a little bit discordant even at times. John Coltrane, I think, really walks the line of that extremely well. I think this kind of went more into the... it just didn't move me, and I think Josh describing it as a film score is a really good way to describe it, because that's what it is.
It's kind of on the other end of that spectrum. If we've got Sanders and Dolphy at one end and Coltrane kind of in the middle, and this album at least is definitely more structured. That's a good way to put it.
It's also important to note that this is not like this is not like what Miles Davis was doing for the majority of his career. This is kind of like a snap of a moment in time, really, right? And so clearly, if you listen to one of the records he did right before this, Kind of Blue sounds nothing like this, right? Kind of Blue is more that traditional sound, and certainly when we get to like something like Bitches Brew, John, you like Mess, you're gonna probably like
Oh no, I enjoyed that album. I think I was just shocked because I know this is so close to Kind of Blue, and I wasn't as familiar with this, and I was expecting at least something that was in that, the Coltrane albums we listened to that had almost the same distance between them. They were different, but they reside in sort of the same. Yeah. This doesn't reside in the same world in some ways that Kind of Blue does. It's a very, very different album. I'm trying to think of like a rock equivalent of like two albums released that close that would be so different, and it's very hard for me to even think of an example.
Well, and that's one of the cool things about Miles Davis is if you like that idea of an artist doing that, of switching stuff up, it's a very Bowie thing, it's a very Prince thing, it's just like let's change sounds and things like that, and he does that throughout his career. But I think I appreciated this album more now listening to it in hindsight, particularly listening to it with headphones, because I never did that, when I first got it. And I also appreciated it more because I actually went back and listened to some of the original versions of these songs, like particularly the first two tracks, like Will o' the Wisp, and then the opening track, the Adagio, because those are actually like real orchestrated, pieces that you can get like on Spotify, and it's cool because they got like the Spanish guitar playing, and it sounds. I think that's probably more of a palatable sound, but it's interesting to hear what he was doing. You know, how he heard those pieces and then what he did on this record, and Gil Evans too. And I think that helped me to appreciate it a little bit more. But it's not my favorite Davis record. I still Kind of Blue is fantastic and probably representative more of something that I really like. But yeah, I do like this. It's certainly more structured. If you like classical music, you're going to like this a little bit more. But I can totally see why this might not float your boat.
Yeah, I can appreciate the departure for him, or kind of the experimentation, or trying something different. And I think this would be a good album to play, maybe at like a dinner party or something. But
show how hip you are, Josh.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. So a couple final thoughts here. So Davis was so drained after recording this record that he didn't even want to listen to it. He claims that he only listened to it after it was released over a year later, and that when he did hear it, he was somewhere else. He was somewhere else and didn't even think anything of it. So he was totally like moving on to whatever the next project was. And then he said he really only listened to it closely once. And he said it didn't have a large impact on him. So he's with you, John. He's all right. I'm done. I'm good. Moving on. The original composer of the title track, Joaquin Rodrigo, did not like the album, but Davis said that to one of his people that let's see if he likes it after he starts to get those royalty checks. So he probably because he probably got more notoriety because of that. Exactly. And then finally, Davis also says that a woman, he doesn't specify who, but some woman years later came up to him and claimed that she played this album for an old retired bullfighter, and it inspired him to suit up one more time and fight and kill a bull. Davis is not sure if that's true, he says, but she said it with such conviction that he has to believe her.
I mean, if that doesn't say Spain, I don't know what does.
There you go.
It's remarkable to me that, as I said, one of the things I'm really enjoying about the jazz is I'm going back, and just when time presents itself, I'm re-listening to those albums as I get more of an education. So I will revisit this, and I reserve the right to change my opinion. But right now, I'm going to kind of go into the can't recommend for me.
Yeah, I would say too, John, that like I found myself listening, especially before hearing the original versions. I found myself really struggling to hear the melody that so moved Davis to inspire him to create this album. Mm-hmm. I feel like I found myself listening to this many times, going, okay, this time I'm going to get it. And even though I liked it, I can't say that I'm blown away by this record, and I don't think that I ever will be. But I still think it's good, and I still think it's worth putting on here and there. But it's not knocking my socks off, I would say. But I'd say slight recommend.
Yeah.
Josh?
Yeah, I'd say slight recommend. Interesting sonic journey to Spain. I think mission accomplished on that front of capturing what Spain might feel like or sound like through Spanish music. And I like the orchestral aspect of it, but it doesn't sound like any other jazz that we've listened to. So.
No, for sure. It's hard to even call this jazz, to be honest.
Right.